All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time where I'm at right now is 5:52 a.m., and today is May 10th, 2025, and this is part 5 of our 11th book in our Book to React series, Marlon B. Ross's Sissy Insurgencies, A Racial Anatomy of Unfit Manliness, and I'm coming to you live early in the morning, knocking this out of the park because we got a lot on our agenda today, so we're trying to get everything done. Got work writing for Culturalist Theory, so go subscribe to that channel, working on the list for Mac 10. Look out for the Too Short and Public Enemy list coming soon. Also got more movie reviews coming with Acti soon, so if you have any films that you requested, put them in the chat and we'll try to get to it. And also, the Book to React series is going strong and long and hard. Pause. No Diddy. So if you have any other books that you think we should read on this channel, put them in the comments section and we'll try to get to it. This book was suggested by DoorOfEl, a longtime subscriber and a person that I agree with probably on most things and disagree with on many other things as well. And I'm very glad that he sent this book because it's very fascinating. It talks about effeminacy, like what it's like to be a heterosexual black man but also have effeminate qualities about you and what that means in this white supremacist world. It's a very academic book, very difficult text to get through, but it's still a very fascinating book. And as I've been reading it, I've been growing and learning, and that's what I hope you do too as we continue to blow through this book. So this is Marlon B. Ross right here, professor at the University of Virginia. This is his book that you can find on Amazon for the humble price of only $30 paperback, $37 hardcover, and we are now jumping into chapter 2. We started reading the section, forgot the name of this section, but basically in this section he's writing about how W.B. Du Bois challenged Booker T. Washington's manliness by his insistence that black people need to not worry about the discrimination that we face from the white society and instead focus on getting our own, as if we need to only focus on economic upliftment, opening businesses, getting educated, and we don't deserve respect as just men by ourselves, right? Just on the fact that we are human beings, we deserve respect and dignity as citizens in the United States as well. And W.B. Du Bois was framing that as George Washington Carver somehow relinquishing his manliness and the masculinity of the black race by allowing us to be disrespected as such. So we're going to continue here with this part. To punctuate this distinction between a sissy social practice and sissy physical embodiment, I'll cap this chapter by briefly examining George Washington Carver, whose case will help us understand the wide berth of sissy conduct, the different valences of the sissy charge, and the scaled racial environs in which such charges can be wielded toward different ends. While the effeminate Carver can be tied to Washington's school marmish apron strings, so to speak, as a scientist dependent on Tuskegee Institute's largesse, without being called out publicly for his gender nonconformity, Washington himself was necessarily exposed as a public target, even though he carefully comported himself according to the dictates of the masculine heteronorm. The very publicness of Washington's mission for the race dictated a sissy practice readily visible to whites while simultaneously practicing a patriarchal manliness as an object lesson for blacks. Ruling white men expected a Washington-like self-humbling that for African American men could seem like rank sycophancy. This seeming contradiction between Washington's masculine deportment and his adversary's charge of his unmanliness is best captured in the most important public performance that launched his international career as head of the race, the Atlanta Exposition Address of 1895. This 5-minute speech was deftly calculated to balance a needed subservience to the powerful white men, Southern and Northern, who were on the stage with him, and Frederick Douglass had done so manfully before him. Describing Washington's training as an orator, which began at Hampton Institute, Marcus H. Bulwer distinguishes between the oratorical oratical styles of Washington and Douglas, noting especially how the former saw himself as calculating every detail to sway an audience. The orate Douglas swayed audiences and himself by the passion of his message. On the other hand, Washington studied every detail and weighed every word, always keeping in mind the final impression he wished to make. In making that impression, he was aware of the importance of personal contact with his audiences. Thus, at the beginning of his speeches, he was somewhat nervous lest he might fail to achieve the visual directness. As Bulwer further notes, Washington was aware of how he exploited his initial nervousness in taking the platform to his advantage as a way to ingratiate himself to an audience. Washington's rhetoric is carefully fashioned as dignified oratory without being so elegant as to alarm whites that he might be an uppity Negro. The folksiness of Washington's oratory, a characteristic of everything he publicly spoke or wrote, also communicates that he is not aligned with what Du Bois would only a couple years later label the talented tenth, with its implication of an educated elite demanding social equality. Instead, Washington's folksy manner of speaking at once identified him as appropriately humble to whites and at the same time approachable and accessible to the mass of formerly enslaved Southerners. This vernacular balance was also intended to maneuver the gender predicament implied by his assumption of racial leadership. We can see this gender maneuvering in the most famous image of that most famous speech, cast down your buckets. So basically, what he's saying here is that, when um, George Washington Carver, no, sorry, yeah, Booker T. Washington, sorry, Booker T. Washington was speaking, he would talk in like a folksy, down home, Southern black man type of way. You know what I mean? Not in an ignorant or like what people would say ghetto way, but in a more like relatable way. Not using really long, complicated words and having a rhythm in his voice that allowed people to easily follow. And this was to not threaten the whites, to make him sound like the good old black people that they know, like the subservient, black people, but also to relate to the black folks who, were not as educated and were a bit ignorant. So he would be more easily approachable or understandable, is how I'm understanding that. Continuing. So, the homely nature of the image belies its sophistry, indeed, its sycophancy. He splits the image between his black and white audience. He addresses it to the white rulers of the nation second. Casting down your bucket among my people, helping and encouraging them as you are doing on these grounds, and to education of head, hand, and heart. You will find that they will buy your surplus land, make blossom the waste places in your fields, and run your factories. While doing this, you can be sure in the future, as in the past, that you and your families will be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, and unresentful people that the world has seen. This sycophancy presents itself openly as a bald racial bargain, a kind of political hardball to agree to be softly subservient to white supremacy in order to secure blacks' economic interests. There is, though, an interesting homonym in the figure of blacks running your factories. To run the factories could mean to be in charge of them as foremen, a charge of middle manliness that from the earliest Jim Crow was reserved for white working class men. To run the factories here, the white managers can assume means only that blacks will be happy to keep their factories running as their hard-working manual and menial laborers. He has preceded the above sentence to ensure the latter reading. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, builded your railroads and cities, and brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth, and helped make possible this magnificent representation of the South. As if that labor not compelled under the duress of enslavement, Washington pits the formerly enslaved against those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits who are likely to engage in labor unrest for better pay, better hours, cleaner plants, and so on. Although his black audience may very well figure in their heads themselves as foremen managing white men's factories, Washington again assures his white audience that he intends no such thing, as indicated by the sentence that follows, the one containing the run homonym. As we have proved our loyalty to you in the past in nursing your children, watching by the sick bed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them tear dimmed eyes to the graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with a devotion that no foreigner can approach, ready to lay down our lives, if need be, in defense of yours. Yeah, now I see why people might say Booker T. Washington was a COON, because this is crazy talk. I mean, basically what he's trying to say is like, yeah, black people will willingly work for less money, less opportunities, less respect on the job, hire us instead of the foreigners who are coming abroad, right? Because when we were under slavery, when we were working together on the fields, building the railroads, building the ports and all that, we cried when Massa died. We, gave the milk from our mothers and our grandmothers to your babies, right? And we've always loved you, so show us some love back. I mean, it's a bit cringe, you know what I mean? Very cringe. I can kind of understand where he's coming from because, like how it is now, like we live under the system of white supremacy, and the people that own the factories, own the banks, have all the money are mostly white men, and we have to, make ourselves subservient to them a lot of the times, right? You got to cut your dreads off to work in some offices. You get what I'm saying? So I get where he's coming from. I get where he's coming from. It's just very cringe. It's very cringe. And this is why I said in the last live stream, like, I generally had positive uh, interpretations of Booker T. Washington, because the way he was taught to us, growing up, is that essentially he just said black people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, open businesses, get educated, and don't worry about racism in general, which is it's something I wholeheartedly disagree with, but it makes logical sense to some degree. And even the heroes I look up to, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, et cetera, said things generally in that line, like we need to separate, we need to get our own. So, I'm sympathetic to some parts of it, other than the part of, getting rid of, like, don't worry about racism. You know what I mean? Anyway, continuing here. The gender genuflection embedded in this sentence is communicated powerfully by the vivid catalog of effeminate tasks, nursing the young and old, mourning the dead with tear-dimmed eyes, and standing humbly in fatal defense of their white superior lives and livelihoods. Washington smartly addresses his black audience first, preparing them mentally and emotionally for the hard bargain that is to come through the advocacy of a softened black manhood. He urges them, cast down your bucket where you are, cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. As if anticipating the charge of sissy cowardice that will be made against him, Washington includes the phrase, in every manly way, to suggest a certain masculine dignity that his words might otherwise contravene. Indeed, in charging his fellow Negroes, gender unspecified, to cast down their buckets in agriculture, mechanics, in commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions, he balances professional ambition with domestic servility. The subtle gender implication of this distinction between the professional and domestic labor will be explained later in the chapter. The genuflection to domestic subservience is, in fact, the greatest grievance that Du Bois has concerning Washington's accommodation as it relates to education and labor. In the next sentence, Washington again negotiates the gender bind by defining Southern opportunity as optimal, suggesting no need to migrate northward. When it comes to business, pure and simple, it is in the South that the Negro is given a man's chance. What does Washington mean by in every manly way and by a man's chance? In one sense, these are hackneyed phrases intended to placate the charge of unmanliness that he is already anticipating as a major stumbling block to his sycophantic practice. In another sense, Washington means what he says. He is advocating for what he sees as the essence of a free man's emancipation. Gender specificity intended. The Oxford English Dictionary indicates the origin of the verb to emancipate from Roman law, to release or set free a child or wife from the patria potestas, the power of the pater familias, thus making the person so set free sui juris. For Washington to perform this act of emancipation means to labor humbly with the hands at the very bottom of the economic ladder on the promise that the accumulation of land and wealth will eventually bring other freedom to not only an emancipated race, but also an emancipated manhood. As he says, we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skills into the common occupations of life. The we here inscribes the black race, man and woman, into a project that deftly sublimates his gender trickery into a collective action, as though a man's chance is the reward for humble, subservient labor, rather than the condition that enables such labor to pay off. So basically, how I'm interpreting this, Booker T. Washington was telling people we will earn our manliness, we will earn our masculinity by doing hard work and also going through the indignities of having to suffer and work twice as hard than the white man, is how I'm interpreting what all of that is putting there. And yeah, what Marlon B. Ross is pointing out is that Booker T. Washington was coding his language in a masculine way, when underlying it, there is a type of a sissiness and a feminateness to it if we view femininity as being, subservient to a more powerful force, right? But Booker T. Washington was trying to hide and mask the basic idea that he was saying, let's be subservient and humble in the white race's presence, earn our manlyhood through buying land, owning businesses, and getting wealth and stuff like that. Then we can become men, rather than we are already men and we will have things because of that. You get what I'm saying? So that's how I'm interpreting that. Anyway, in language fashioned especially to appeal simultaneously, if differently, to the white male rulers and the formerly enslaved masses, Washington from the outset negotiates this gender dilemma: how to be subserviently humble in every manly way, by helping his audience to imagine a conduct that can be at once racially humble and manfully dignified, calculated to appease the cross-racial audience standing before him. The speech is also aimed at mass distribution, which he achieves when it is reprinted in newspapers in both the North and the South, and allotted a chapter in his immensely popular autobiography, Up from Slavery, published 3 years after the speech. Understanding that his program will succeed based on how he himself is received as appropriately in his place as a self-humbling black man by whites, and yet deemed robustly competent to husband the race's future. Washington exploits the most commonplace expressions of masculine propriety in every manly way, a man's chance, ironically, to promise a race of men at ease in taking on sissy subservience, nursing your children, watching by the sick beds of your mothers and fathers, following your tear-dimmed eyes, your dead to your graves, and an imagery whose gender trickery results from the unspecified gender attribution normally made between a woman's softer domestic mission and a man's more worldly ambition. This is the racial bargain broadcast across America, as it necessarily bespeaks the gender compromise that Washington's critics will pounce on to eviscerate his leadership. Speechifying was one of the major ways that black men could gain the attention of the early Jim Crow white power structure without appearing too ambitiously uppity, for whites were comfortable viewing black men as good orators, good talkers, as long as such talk was not aimed at upsetting the color line. Indeed, oratory was seen as suited to the temperance of the race, whose gender temperament was thought to be designed for emotion, fidelity, superstition, and the histrionic, attributes usually identified with women of the dominant race. Such an attitude was glaringly evident in one of the most important tributes made by an influential white man to a black man in the 1890s. William Dean Howells, the most influential critic of his generation, first published his tribute in 1896 in a favorable review of Paul Laurence Dunbar's second volume of poetry, Majors and Minors, and republished it in a slightly different version as the introduction to Dunbar's third volume, Lyrics of Lowly Life. Repeatedly in that introduction, Howell references what he takes to be the different temperaments of the race, writing that however gifted his race had proven itself in music, in oratory, and several of the other arts, he was the first instance of an American Negro who had evinced innate distinction in literature. Howells continues, "Yet it appears to me then and appears to me now that there is a precious difference of temperament between the races, which it would be a great pity ever to lose, and that this is best preserved and most charmingly suggested by Mr. Dunbar in those pieces of his where he studies the moods and traits of his race in its own in its own accent of our English. In nothing is his essentially refined and delicate art so well shown as in these pieces, which, as I venture to say, describe the range between appetite and emotion, with certain lifts far beyond and above it, which is the range of the race." So basically, this guy was saying here, like, yeah, this black man is a talented writer, but, basically all he's doing is just taking our English and relaying the stories of his people back to us. And let's not, forget, guys, the races are essentially different according to this white man who wrote this about this black author. So let's not lose that. Yeah, the black people are good at singing, at dancing, at giving speeches, but that's because they're naturally histrionic, they're naturally emotional people, and let's keep it that way. Let them continue to do their own thing. We shouldn't encourage them, trying to be like us. So, assigning the range of the race between appetite and emotion, suggesting the softer affects of humor, hankering, tenderness, sentiment, and pathos, necessarily implies what is missing from this range, the more robust dimensions of temperament associated with rationality, valor, gustiness, ambition, willpower, and the heroic. This view is summed up by the sociologist Robert Park when he calls the Negro the lady of the races. That's who said it. I've always thought about that quote a lot. The lady of the races, Robert Park, when he said that. Okay. Even though white allies like Howells and Park were eager to grant black men oratorical mastery, they were, at the same time, still putting black men in a lower, less than manly place. Nonetheless, it is important to remember that, as black leaders well understood, public speaking was the main way, besides periodical print, of reaching a broad mass audience in the early decades of the 20th century. Indeed, notable speeches were routinely printed in mainstream white newspapers, a rare opportunity for black leaders to court a cross-racial audience. While black men speechifying occasions, a rare stage for staking a claim to racial leadership, such oratory equally poses racial danger if the orator fails to balance some manly way for the black audience while signaling racial sycophancy to the white audience. Basically, it's a delicate line that Booker T. Washington was walking, having to, show that he is a sycophant to white power, but also that he is still a man to black people, right? So, continuing. Given this common attitude toward Negroes, and particularly the Negro male, Washington understood the difficult gender balancing act required in delivering an acceptable Jim Crow speech aimed at claiming one's authority as a racial spokesman. While the performance of oratory mastery is critical for any Negro who desired leadership of the race in this period, and especially one who desired the endorsement of the white male elite, enacting this gender balance through oratory also presents a danger. How can one speak authoritatively in every manly way without sounding uppity? This gender balancing act, at once a proper husband to the race and not an uppity Negro claiming his full manly emancipation, was hard to accomplish even for the Wizard of Tuskegee. Indeed, as Du Bois was careful to point out in the chapter of Souls of Black Folks titled Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, Washington tripped up badly once in an 1898 speech delivered at the Chicago Peace Jubilee, celebrating victory in the Spanish-American War. Delivered before an audience that included President McKinley, in his speech, The Better Part, Washington intones, "We can celebrate the era of peace in no more effectual way than by a firm resolve on the part of Northern men and Southern men, black men and white men, that the trenches which we together dug around Santiago shall be the eternal burial place of all that which separates us in our business and civil relations. Let us be as generous in peace as we have been brave in battle." Washington's first personal plural here is the same strategy that he used in the Atlanta exposition speech, but toward a different effect, aggressively attacking rather than subserviently submitting to the Jim Crow order. As I indicated in Chapter 1, manly victory in warfare was long seen as a venue to assert black men's right to full emancipation. It is in this heady context of being invited to this Thanksgiving Jubilee, celebrating the nation's imperialist victory, that Washington feels emboldened to assert that black men who fought alongside white men in the trenches of Cuba, the same brave soldiers buried in those trenches, should not be treated separately in life. This metaphor of a shared grave directly references and counters his earlier fingers slash hand metaphor of the 1895 Atlanta exposition speech. Basically, what he's saying is, like, Booker T. Washington gave this speech where basically we're all one people, guys. We all died fighting against the Filipinos, right? We all went to Cuba and tried to subjugate the Cuban people, right? So us Americans, no matter if we're black men or white men, need to come together. But earlier, probably Booker T. Washington gave a speech saying, "Listen, guys, we're all on the same hand, but we're different fingers. We got black fingers, we got white fingers, we got red fingers. We're all separate, but we're all together." So, anyway, in the Better Part speech, Washington boldly attacks racial prejudice as a cancer gnawing at the heart of the Republic that shall one day prove as dangerous as an attack from an army without or within. The response to this speech was so violent that Washington had to clarify his stance and reaffirm his separate as the fingers, one as the hand dictum from the 1895 address. We can only imagine Washington's oratorical, why couldn't I say oratorical? I'm so bad. Okay, we can only imagine Washington's oratorical delivery as he seeks to steal this moment to burnish his manly authority before the president and many other dignitaries seated on the dais and an audience solely of white Northerners. According to Harlan, a crowd of 16,000 so tightly packed that he needed a policeman to help him make his way into the auditorium, where the president is seated on the dais behind him. His ready retreat to the Atlanta separatist accommodation was no doubt a sign of defeat, and yet one that the great accommodator would have anticipated on taking this man's chance in the first place. Coming still early in his reign, only 3 years after the Atlanta Compromise address, this was not an oratorical misstep that he would make again. Basically, he got in trouble by saying racism is the real problem in America. Booker T. Washington, the man that said black people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, black men need to buy businesses and get educated and get land and not worry about racial animus, said one time, hey, racism is really the biggest problem in America, and the white folks got really pissed, so then he had to double back. Okay. So we can gauge Washington's skill as a successful sycophantic orator by contrasting his performance and the gender conduct that flows with it with that of the young William Pickens, who learns the hard way when he puts himself forward as a spokesman for the race in his 1903 Yale Oratory Contest speech. Misrule in Haiti, the 21-year-old college student from the backwoods of Arkansas, makes some dangerous missteps and so clearly aligning himself with Washingtonian accommodation, as vividly recorded in Sheldon Avery's biography, Up from Washington. That's funny. To his white audience at Yale, when he advocates for the subjugation of the island by America as an act of kindness, he is implicitly agreeing with Washington's rhetoric in Up from Slavery, where the temporary enslavement of the American Negro is characterized as a blessing in disguise. Ooh, this hurts to read. Basically, there was this young black man, over 100 years ago, who went to Yale, and he ended up becoming a COON because he's standing on stage telling his white classmates America should invade the black free Republic of Haiti because that'll be a good thing for them. And slavery was a good thing for us too. It got us out of Africa, right, guys? Like, basically, this is very bad, very very bad, very bad. Okay. Pickenson's oratorical ingratiation, not to say sycophancy, indicates his desire to attract Washington's stronger hand in support of his career, especially given that at this point, Pickens aspires to become the president of a black college in the Bookerite manner. According to Avery, the Yale address does attract Washington's interest and initial patronage. Pickenson's humble attitude toward winning the prize significantly counters his own later account of his aggressive self confidence in his 1923 autobiography, Bursting Bonds, indicating a discursive shift from strategic sycophancy to self assertive masculinity. Unfortunately for Pickens, winning the oratory contest brings attention as well from Washington's greatest adversary, William Monroe Trotter, militant editor of the Boston Guardian. No doubt, such negative attention from Trotter, who lodges an attack on the young student's manhood, helps to reorient Pickens away from a Bookerite strategy of gender self humbling. Calling Pickens uncouth and provincial, Trotter suggests that the only reason he is the first Negro to win the coveted prize is his surrendering his self respect, sacrificing his pride, emasculating his manhood, and throwing down his race. Washington then attempted to exploit Pickens in a libel suit against Trotter, which must which must have been a quick and dirty lesson for the young college man in the dangers of accommodationist sycophancy. The gender genuflection that Washington seemed to manage so deftly, Pickens discovered he was much harder than it appeared. Similarly, by situating black manhood as the subject and object of melancholic wastage, Du Bois risks setting himself up for the kind of charge of injury to the race's manhood that Trotter makes against the young Pickens and that Du Bois himself makes against Washington. Even in an age that tolerates and indeed to some extent encourages lachrymose men much more than our own does. Lachrymose. This is a new word. Lachrymose. I need to know what this means. Lachrymose. Definition. Tearful or given to weeping. Basically crybabies. Lachrymose. Lachrymose. Oh, this is a nice word. I like this word. Lachrymose. All right. Lachrymose. Tearful or given to weeping. All right. It can also be an adjective meaning producing tears or sad. Oh, wait. Hold on, wait. Here we go. Inducing tears, sad. Let's put lachrymose in the chat, too. Okay. All right, anyway. Continuing on here. Continuing on. Okay. So, even in an age that tolerates and indeed to some extent encourages crybaby men, he's talking about now, 2025, or when this book was written, 2020, lachrymose men, much more than our own does, Du Bois's outpouring of lamentation associates the persona of souls more closely with the hysterically grieving mother than with the stolid race husband, despite his attempt to delineate these roles along normative gender lines. That a black male writer of the time could easily pick up on this gender slippage in Du Bois comes from one of Du Bois's own colleagues, Kelly Miller. As a member of the American Negro Academy, a forum in which Du Bois first presents some of the writing that eventually becomes a section of Souls of Black Folk, Miller is an important figure in post Reconstruction political contests. His 1908 book, Race Adjustment, leads off with the largely pro Washington piece, Race Adjustment, Radicals and Conservatives. Implicit in Miller's characterization of black men who would lead their race is a question of how best to husband the resources of masculinity, cast as a binary between an unbridled, rugged virility, a kind of barbarism, versus a polished, discerning diplomacy, a kind of urbane manliness cultivated by James Weldon Johnson, as discussed in Chapter 3. All right, continuing here before we jump ahead. All right, how many pages we got left? All right, we're gonna read. Yeah, we're gonna make it. We're gonna make it. Just checking, because that sleep is starting to hit me now. Starting to hit me now. Okay, but we can hit that. We can hit that. All right. All right, so let's continue here. All right. His 1908 book, Race Adjustment, leads off with a largely pro Washington piece, Race Adjustment, Radicals and Conservatives. Implicit in Miller's characterization of black men, who would lead the race is a question of how best to husband the resources of masculinity, cast as a binary between an unbridled, rugged virility, a kind of barbarism, versus a polished, discerning diplomacy, a kind of urbane manliness cultivated by James Weldon Johnson, as discussed in Chapter 3. Miller places Trotter at one extreme. He has thrown away all of the restraints of culture, spurned the allurements of refined association, and conducts The Guardian with as little regard to literary form and style as if he were a backwoodsman. Miller speaks to a higher plane of manliness than one based in brute physicality. If Miller casts Trotter as the unruly, rude backwoodsman who has wasted his elite talents, he places Washington in the starring role as a man who has husbanded his resources well, despite lacking all of Trotter's elite privileges. He rises triumphantly on stepping stones of his dead self to higher things. Washington's Washington's equability of temper is most remarkable. What I am calling Washington's gender fluidity, Miller labels equability of temper, a quality needed in an age of emerging Jim Crow. The narrative of Washington's growth clearly charts a development into manhood. Through such laudatory language, Miller is able to meld power of enlargement with supple fluidity, a quality that could easily be seen negatively as a political slipperiness of an unctuous lickspittle. Marlon B. Ross is a horrible writer. This is horrible writing. Funny writing, but horrible writing. Some of these words are so obscure. All right. So, there is no doubt that Miller is rebutting Du Bois's highly influential attack on Washington's manhood of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. What is made to be a liability is Du Bois's characterization of Washington's gender positioning is here turned into a supreme performance of manliness. Through his attack on Trotter, Miller is able to warn his friend Du Bois to back away from his flirtations with Trotter. Miller does so by turning Du Bois into an innocent victim of Trotter's machinations. He wove a subtle yet he wove a subtle net about W.B. Du Bois, the brilliant writer and scholar, and gradually weaned him from his erstwhile friendship for Mr. Washington so as to exploit his prominence and splendid powers in behalf of the hostile forces. Okay, so this is getting a bit too dense for me, and now I'm getting hit with that tiredness, so I'm gonna wrap it up here. I'm sorry, I just can't continue. This is too much, even though this is very hilarious. I love hearing this this back and forth dissing of people, because people think, in hip hop, people just started dissing each other. But this is actually very interesting. I'm just a bit too tired to stay up with it. So I'm going to wrap it up here. And for anybody that catches this on the playback, shout out to all of you as well. And let me know if you want me to do more live streams with the microphone to my mouth like this, if this sounds better, or if you prefer it back like traditional style. But let me know how you feel. And shout out to everybody who's going to watch this. I'll catch y'all tomorrow, maybe even later today. We might, might wake up later and do some more reading later today after my classes and all that good stuff. So y'all be easy.